What happens when the most powerful military alliance in history gets called a paper tiger by the very country that built it, funded it, and led it for nearly a century? This isn't a hypothetical. On April 1st, 2026, the American president made it official, citing European allies providing absolutely nothing for the US-led war against Iran. He declared American withdrawal from NATO was now beyond reconsideration. A predictable shockwave hit the continent. Headlines blared, diplomatic phones lit up, and then a strange and profound silence. The expected panic never arrived. The emergency summits were never called. No one scrambled to appease Washington. This quiet defiance is the real story. And to understand why Europe didn't flinch, we have to go back. So we go back, not by weeks, but by months. Before the American president's threat to withdraw, there was a decision that set this entire crisis in motion. And it wasn't made in Brussels, the heart of NATO. It was made in Washington and Tel Aviv. The date was February 28th. On that day, the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign against Iran. Now, the geopolitical merits of that decision are a topic for another day. What is critical for our story, for understanding the deep fracture that followed, is how it was done, unilaterally. There was no UN Security Council resolution. And most importantly, the NATO Council's formal consultation process was completely bypassed. For the nations of Europe, this wasn't just a diplomatic slight. It was a structural crisis. It placed them in an impossible position, forcing a choice between two conflicting loyalties. Loyalty to their oldest, most powerful ally, or loyalty to the foundational principles of the very treaty that bound them together. Think about it. They were being asked to support a war of choice, one they had no say in, a war that had a very high probability of destabilizing their own backyard. The European response when it came was not the scattered, hesitant panic that Washington seemed to expect. It was a cold, coordinated, and resolute no. And you could literally see this refusal build, like a wall appearing on the map of Europe. First, Spain announced a full ban. Its airspace was closed to any military flights related to the Iran campaign. The critical American naval station at Rote and the air base at Moran, off limits. Then, France followed, restricting overflights for any transports carrying weapons for the war. Then Italy denied landing rights at key bases like Sigonella for American bombers. One by one, the doors that America had long taken for granted were quietly, professionally, and legally shut. It was a quiet, bureaucratic, but impenetrable wall of non-cooperation. Their justification wasn't emotional, it was legal. It was grounded in the very text of the North Atlantic Treaty. You see, the heart of NATO is Article 5. It's an ironclad promise. An attack against one ally is an attack against all. But the key word, the word that foreign ministries from Berlin to Madrid stood on, is attack. It mandates a collective defense. It was never intended as an obligation, a blank check, for every member to join one country's offensive campaign. In public statements, European leaders were clear and consistent. This conflict, they said, has nothing to do with NATO. In their cold, legal assessment, this was simply not their war. The American accusation was inaction. The European reality was a choice to defend the treaty, even from its most powerful member, a choice. From the European perspective, it was a choice to defend the treaty, even from its most powerful member. But across the Atlantic in Washington, D.C., that is not how it was seen. Not at all. It wasn't interpreted as a principled stand. It was felt as a profound betrayal. To understand what happened next, you have to place yourself inside the American administration's mindset at that moment. The internal logic was stark and, in their view, completely justified. We are fighting a war, and our so-called allies are not just on the sidelines. They are actively obstructing us. They are using our own treaty against us. If they won't act like allies, why are we obligated to protect them? This deep-seated frustration began to boil over. The tension moved from private, tense diplomatic cables to the public square, raw and unfiltered. First, it was the pointed accusations, with the president declaring that European allies were expecting U.S. protection without reciprocity, framing their legal firewall as simple free riding. Then the language became even more blunt, stripping away all diplomatic pretense. The official statement was a gut punch. We're very disappointed with NATO because NATO has done absolutely nothing. And right there, that's the connection. The shocking threat we saw at the very beginning of this story, the paper tiger ultimatum. It wasn't a random outburst in a moment of anger. It was the culmination of this building rage. It was a deliberate act of public pressure, a political sledgehammer designed to punish this perceived disobedience and force the allies back into line. The threat was a question shouted from the world's biggest stage: are you with us or are you against us? But the threat itself, as loud and as world-shaking as it was, wasn't the main event. It wasn't the climax of this crisis. The real story, the moment that truly redefined the alliance, was the response. Or, more accurately, it was the deafening, calculated, and utterly unexpected silence that followed. That silence wasn't an absence of response. It was the response. It was the clearest signal Europe could send, and it was one of profound systemic readiness. We now arrive at the heart of the matter. For years, European strategists had quietly prepared for a future where the American security guarantee was no longer certain. The public threat was not a shock, but the arrival of an expected future. The absence of panic was the most important signal of all, because it showed Europe was treating this not as a sudden crisis, but as a long-expected transformation. But to file this away as merely a mindset shift is to fundamentally misread the board. That's the surface-level analysis you'll see everywhere else. The true signal wasn't a change in strategic documents. It was the quiet, systematic rerouting of capital, industry, and infrastructure. If you only see the philosophy, you miss the plumbing. And in geopolitics, the plumbing is where power actually flows. Let's examine that plumbing. The first layer was a massive, systematic surge in defense spending. According to SIPRI data, by 2024, 18 out of 32 NATO members were meeting or exceeding the 2% GDP defense spending target. That's up from just 11 the year before. Poland, for instance, became a stark example, surging its spending to a remarkable 4.2% of its GDP. More importantly, this money wasn't just for buying off-the-shelf American hardware. It was being channeled into building the architecture of true strategic autonomy. The EU launched the European Defense Industry Program, or EDIP, with an initial budget of 1.5 billion euros. It also created the SAFE instrument, providing up to 150 billion euros in loans for joint military procurement. Critically, these programs mandate that at least 65% of the components in these joint projects must be of EU origin. This is not about being a better customer. It's about ceasing to be a customer at all. This drive for autonomy extended beyond the military. The digital euro project, often discussed in purely economic terms, was explicitly framed by the European Central Bank as a tool to enhance strategic autonomy by reducing reliance on non-European payment systems. So when you put this all together, the surge in spending, the integrated weapons programs with domestic content rules, the parallel financial rails, you realize that the silence we observed wasn't the silence of apathy or fear. It was the quiet confidence of a player who has spent years preparing their next move. This methodical, long-term preparation is the part of the story that rarely makes headlines. Based on what you see in your own field, does this absence of panic and quiet preparation resonate? I'm genuinely curious to read your perspective in the comments. This drive for strategic independence, this desire to control its own destiny, isn't a new impulse in Europe. In fact, to truly grasp its historical depth, we have to look back to another French leader who, decades ago, looked at the NATO structure and saw not a permanent shield, but a temporary arrangement. To understand today's transformation, we must first understand Charles de Gaulle. And so, to understand this modern European resolve, we have to travel back, not just a few years, but decades. Back to a moment when the alliance faced its first great internal crisis, engineered by a man who was, himself, a living symbol of national sovereignty, Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle wasn't just a politician, he was a force of nature. He was the man recalled from a 12-year political exile, his famous crossing of the desert, to literally save France from the brink of civil war in 1958 over the crisis in Algeria. He had restored the nation. And from that vantage point, he looked at the post-war order and saw something that deeply troubled him. He saw NATO, the very shield of Europe, as an instrument of American dominance, a structure that infringed on the French sovereignty he had spent his life fighting for. His goal was simple and absolute, the restoration of French grandeur on the world stage, and that led to March 7th, 1966. On that day, de Gaulle took a step so radical it sent shockwaves across the entire Western world. He sent a formal letter to U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson. It stated in no uncertain terms that France was determined to, quote, regain on her whole territory the full exercise of her sovereignty, at present diminished by the permanent presence of allied military elements. It was a declaration of operational independence. France was withdrawing from NATO's integrated military command, and he gave the alliance 1 year to get all foreign troops, all equipment, and all headquarters off of French soil. What followed was not just a diplomatic crisis, it was a logistical nightmare. Imagine the scene at NATO's headquarters in Paris, a frantic, controlled chaos, decades of strategic files, maps, and intelligence reports being stuffed into wooden crates. Picture the convoys of military trucks, 30,000 American and Allied troops in total, rumbling down French highways towards the borders of Belgium and Germany. It was a physical tearing apart of the alliance's central nervous system. The alliance, which had been headquartered in Paris since 1952, was suddenly homeless. The entire organization was shaken to its very core. This should have been the end. A core founding member had just unilaterally evicted the entire military structure. Commentators at the time predicted the alliance would collapse, but it didn't. The alliance adapted, a new headquarters was hastily constructed in Brussels. More importantly, the political shock forced the organization to evolve. In response, NATO adopted the 1960s Van Harmel report. This was a critical update to its software. It modernized the alliance's mission to include not just military defense, but also political consultation and détente, an opening of dialogue with the Soviet bloc. De Gaulle had achieved his goal of operational sovereignty, but France remained a political signatory of the treaty. The structure had proven it was flexible enough to survive a direct challenge from within. It bent, but it did not break. This historical precedent is the key. It shows that the drive for European sovereignty is not a new or destructive force. It's a recurring pattern. But there is a fundamental difference between de Gaulle's calculated move and the threat we see today. De Gaulle's gambit was designed to reclaim sovereignty within the Western framework. What happens when the threat isn't a renegotiation, but a potential dismantling of the framework itself? Answering that reveals a very different kind of vulnerability. That different kind of vulnerability wasn't theoretical. It was playing out in real time, thousands of kilometers from the halls of Brussels. Because while the political drama unfolded within NATO, the very war that catalyzed it all was demonstrating a hard lesson about the limits of conventional military power. Iran, of course, could never hope to match the United States in a direct symmetrical military confrontation, so it didn't try. Instead, it changed the rules of the game by activating its most powerful piece of asymmetric leverage, its control over the Strait of Hormuz. To be precise, this wasn't just about geography, it was about targeting the global economy's most critical artery. Roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply flows through that single narrow choke point. Iran's threat was simple. They could squeeze it shut. And for a time, they did. The effect on global shipping was almost immediate. Daily ship transits, which normally numbered over 120, collapsed to just 4. On trading floors from Tokyo to Frankfurt, screens flashed red. News anchors who had been focused on NATO were suddenly reporting on surging fuel prices. We saw worried statements from the leaders of oil-importing nations across Asia. This wasn't a battle fought with missiles, but with mathematics, the cold calculus of economic pain. Iran had found a way to wound a superpower without ever winning a battle. The American military response, when it escalated, felt born of frustration. It was a demonstration of overwhelming force in a situation that didn't call for it. Then the footage surfaced. It wasn't an official release. It was grainy, shaky video, the kind that feels more real because of its low fidelity. It showed a precision strike on a newly constructed bridge, a civilian bridge connecting Tehran and Karaj. The resulting civilian casualties were undeniable, and the international condemnation was swift. The stalemate wasn't broken. It was cemented in tragedy and backlash. And for the leadership in Paris and Berlin, watching this unfold, it was a profound data point. It confirmed the perspective that had been driving their entire strategy of autonomy. In a complex, deeply interconnected world, military power is often a blunt and ultimately inefficient instrument. The quagmire in the Gulf strengthened their case that true, durable power in the 21st century must be multifaceted, economic, diplomatic, and regulatory. It made their quiet preparations seem less like an ideological choice and more like a pragmatic necessity. So let's connect these two distinct threads. On one side, a political fracture threatening to dismantle the West's primary security alliance. On the other, a military stalemate revealing the stark limits of that alliance's most powerful member. When you place these two events side by side, you don't just see a crisis. You begin to see the outline of a new counterintuitive truth about power itself. That new counterintuitive truth is this. When a global leader issues a threat to its allies and is met not with panicked obedience, but with quiet, coordinated defiance, a profound change has occurred. This is not a spectacle of power. It is the quiet, administrative process of influence being transferred. This is the fundamental reason why calling NATO a paper tiger for refusing to join an offensive war was a complete misreading of the situation. As one analyst aptly put it, this critique stems from a misunderstanding of what NATO is supposed to be in the first place. The alliance's structural integrity was proven precisely because it refused to be converted into an offensive tool, thereby reaffirming its core defensive purpose for all members. And this forces us to confront the ultimate question for the entire post-Cold War order. If threats are no longer enough to bring allies into alignment, then what does that say about the true state of American influence? For most of the world, this is a fascinating geopolitical analysis. But for Canadians, this is something far more significant. It is a once-in-a-generation strategic warning and a hidden opportunity. And the key is understanding how to act now that the old rules no longer apply. A new chapter in the transatlantic story is being written. As Europe builds its own formidable defense industrial base, it is actively looking for trusted partners. This fundamentally breaks the West's historic century-long dependency on a single U.S.-centric supply chain for its most advanced defense systems. For Canada, this isn't a peripheral development. It is the core opportunity. For decades, over 70% of Canada's major defense procurement has been tied to U.S. suppliers. This created not just economic dependencies, but deep strategic vulnerabilities, limiting our industrial base and narrowing our foreign policy options. Today, that structure is changing. Canada, with its unique position as a G7 nation, a committed NATO member, and a North American country, is perfectly placed to become the transatlantic industrial and strategic bridge. This is not a theory. it is already happening. And this is where our analysis must move past mainstream commentary. Most are still debating the old reality, while the new one is being forged in contracts and partnerships. The next few moments are not about abstract potential. They are about the specific programs quietly rerouting Canada's economic and strategic future. Pay close attention. In a landmark move in December 2025, Canada became the first non-European G7 nation to join the EU's $150 billion SAFE program, the Strategic Autonomy Fund for Europe. This isn't just a political statement, it's a direct entry point for Canadian industry into the joint procurement of critical capabilities, from missile defense to next-generation cyber systems. This move is the cornerstone of Ottawa's new defense industrial strategy, which explicitly aims to reduce reliance on any single supplier and build sovereign capability while ensuring full NATO interoperability. So what does this diversification actually look like? It looks like a future Canadian frigate built in Halifax, equipped with advanced European missile interceptors. It looks like Canadian tech firms in Waterloo and Montreal collaborating directly with partners in Germany and France on the drone and sensor technologies that will define the next decade. It means Canada is moving from a passive recipient of security, dependent on a single provider, to an active co-shaper of a renewed and more balanced alliance. This path offers Canada a level of strategic agency it has not possessed in generations. But seizing this opportunity requires more than just signing partnership deals. It requires navigating a critical and often invisible fault line that runs directly through Europe itself. Understanding this internal tension is non-negotiable, because getting it wrong is how this strategic gain could quickly become a catastrophic miscalculation. And that miscalculation begins by mistaking Europe's unified response for a uniform belief. On the surface, the drive towards strategic autonomy looks like a continent moving in lockstep. But if we slow down and examine the architecture of this new European consensus, we find a deep structural division. This isn't a minor disagreement. It's a fundamental split between two strategic poles. In the West, nations like France and Germany are the primary champions of full strategic autonomy, aiming to build a Europe that can act independently on the world stage. But in the East, frontline states like Poland and the Baltic nations, who share a border with Russia, view this through a much harsher lens. For them, the American security guarantee isn't a matter of preference, it's existential. Leaders there have explicitly called the idea of full European autonomy unrealistic, because they remain dependent on U.S. nuclear and intelligence capabilities. This tension is well documented by institutions like Carnegie and Chatham House, who frame it as a clash between the West's desire for de-risking and the East's non-negotiable demand for unbreakable deterrence. This creates the fault line. A push for European autonomy that moves too fast or too far risks leaving these frontline states feeling abandoned, potentially fragmenting the very alliance it's meant to strengthen. As NATO's own Secretary General, Mark Rutte, bluntly warned in January 2026, Europe cannot defend itself without the United States. This highlights the dangerous gap between political ambition and present military reality. This is precisely where Canada's true strategic role materializes, not as a simple opportunist picking a winning side, but as a pragmatic intermediary. Imagine a map of the Transatlantic Alliance. You have the Western European pole pulling towards autonomy and the Eastern European pole anchored firmly to Washington. Canada sits in the middle, not torn between them, but uniquely positioned to connect them. As a trusted partner to both the United States and the emerging European structures, Canada can help balance these forces, reinforcing Europe's new capabilities while ensuring the entire transatlantic bridge remains stable and strong. In a world flooded with oversimplified narratives, understanding these deeper structural dynamics is what separates strategic action from wishful thinking. Canada's path forward lies not in choosing between Europe and America, but in mastering its unique role in holding this new, more complex alliance together. If you appreciate analyses that go beyond the headlines to connect the dots on global strategy, consider liking this video and subscribing for more.